The night had already fallen over San Giovanni Rotondo, and Padre Pio's convent lay in silence. In the monastery's courtyard, amid the gentle rustle of the trees and the pale glow of the moon, a solitary figure walked in prayer. His face was serene, yet his presence carried an invisible weight, as if every step was sustained by a higher force. It was Padre Pio, the stigmatized friar whom so many sought for comfort and miracles. He held a rosary between his fingers, reciting each Hail Mary with the devotion of one who knew that God was there, listening. His fame had already crossed the borders of Italy, and daily people arrived at the convent, desperate for a word, a blessing, or a miracle. That same night, a few streets away, a group of young men gathered in front of a small tavern. There were 5 of them, laughing loudly and sharing scornful stories about the faith that dominated the city. Antonio, the group's leader, wore a sarcastic smile as he gestured, mocking the people who believed in Padre Pio's miracles. "This friar is nothing more than an old man with scars on his hands," he said, while the others laughed. Ricardo, who always recorded everything with his small recorder, suggested they go to the convent. "Let's see if this Padre Pio guy is really special," he challenged. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and without hesitating, the 5 young men headed to the monastery, driven more by daring than by curiosity. The path was narrow and silent, a stark contrast to the noise they were making. The houses around were already dark, and only the weak light of the street lamps illuminated the way. When they arrived at the convent's gate, they hesitated for a moment. There was something in the atmosphere that felt heavier than expected. "Come on, let's go," insisted Matteo, the most impulsive of the group. The chill of the early morning blew over the hills, but they ignored the shiver running down their spines and pressed on. In the convent's central square, they spotted the figure of a man in a Franciscan habit, walking calmly, his eyes fixed on the sky. There was no doubt. It was him. Silence reigned for a few seconds. Antonio, who had always found it easy to ridicule anything, found himself unexpectedly speechless. Padre Pio halted his walk, as if he had known of the young men's presence even before he saw them. Slowly, he turned toward them. His gaze was not one of reproach or anger. It was a deep look that seemed to pierce through any barrier of arrogance or disbelief. "Have you come seeking something?" he asked, his voice firm yet welcoming. The young men exchanged looks, trying to recover their mocking posture. "We came to see what's so special here," Antonio replied, folding his arms. Padre Pio sighed, lowered his gaze to the rosary in his hands, and said simply, "We do not always know what we are seeking, but the truth always finds us." The wind seemed to blow harder at that moment, and the church bells, which had been silent until then, began to ring softly, without anyone having set them in motion. The young men looked at each other, uncomfortable. Something was changing around them. The provocation they had planned no longer seemed so simple, and without realizing it, that encounter would not be merely an act of curiosity, but the beginning of a transformation they would never forget. The silence that settled in the convent square was unlike any other the young men had experienced before. It wasn't just the absence of sound, but a kind of invisible presence that hung in the air, as if something much greater than themselves were there, watching. However, Antonio did not want to give in. With a half-smile laden with irony, he broke the quiet. "So is that how you convince people, with catchphrases and a mysterious look?" Ricardo, holding his recorder, laughed, encouraging the others to resume the mocking tone they had planned. "Maybe he has some trick hidden up his sleeve," Matteo teased. Padre Pio remained serene. His tired yet peaceful eyes rested upon the young men with a compassion they did not expect. "I am not the one who convinces anyone. The truth reveals itself to those who are willing to see it," he replied calmly. His voice bore neither arrogance nor defensiveness. It was merely an observation, something so simple and true that for a moment Antonio's chest tightened, but he did not want to show it. He turned to his friends and smiled. "All right then, Show me this truth, Father. Give us a sign. Prove to us that there is something beyond stories meant to deceive the faithful." Ricardo, excited by the provocation, grabbed his recorder and pressed the button to record everything. "That's what we want to know. Where are the miracles, the healings, or is it all just coincidence and superstition?" The laughter of the other young men echoed through the square, but there was a growing nervousness among them. Matteo crossed his arms, as if trying to shield himself from the cold that suddenly seemed more intense. Luca, the quietest of the group, looked up at the sky, feeling an odd discomfort. It was as if the wind blowing around them were not natural. Padre Pio did not move. He only closed his eyes for a moment, as if in prayer. When he spoke again, his voice was firm, yet without harshness. "You demand proofs of God, but he reveals himself in simplicity, in silence, in the transformation of the heart. Miracles happen every day, but to see them, one must first be willing to believe." Those words touched something inside Antonio, but he quickly pushed the thought away. He was not there to be convinced. He was there to prove that it was all just an act. "Then transform me, Father. Make me believe," he challenged. It was at that moment that something strange happened. The church bells, which had previously sounded softly in the wind, now began to ring more intensely, as if someone were shaking them forcefully. The young men turned, startled, toward the bell tower, but there was no one there. Ricardo looked at the recorder in his hand. The red light indicated that it was still recording, but a strange noise emerged from the audio, as if interference were taking over. The wind grew stronger, and the trees around the convent began to sway violently, even though the rest of the town seemed motionless. Antonio felt a shiver run up his spine, but he refused to accept what was happening. "It's just a coincidence," he murmured to himself. Yet deep down, something within him began to waver. The wind continued to howl among the stone walls of the convent, and the church bells tolled inexplicably. Ricardo gripped the recorder tightly, watching its screen tremble as if it were picking up something invisible. Luca took a step back, uncertain whether this was still a joke or if they had gone too far. But Antonio refused to yield. His pride prevented him from accepting anything other than what he already believed. He scoffed, trying to regain control of the situation. "So, this is your big miracle. A bit of wind and a bell sound. That doesn't impress me." Matteo, the most impetuous of the group, stepped forward, pointing at the rosary Padre Pio held between his fingers. "And this rosary? They say it has power, right? Let's see if it's true." His tone was provocative, but his voice carried a slight hesitation. Without waiting for a response, he reached out and tried to snatch the rosary from the friar's hands. At the exact moment his fingers touched the cold beads, a shock ran through his arm, as if an electric current had passed through his body. Matteo recoiled sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. "What was that?" he exclaimed, frightened. Antonio laughed, trying to disguise the growing discomfort. "Are you scared now?" he mocked, but Matteo did not answer. His eyes were fixed on his own hands, which trembled slightly. Padre Pio remained motionless, watching them without any sign of fear or reproach. His gaze was one of pity, as if he knew that this rebelliousness was merely a mask for something deeper. "One does not toy with that which is sacred, my son," he said gently, yet his voice carried a firmness that made the entire group fall silent. The silence was broken by a loud crack. Ricardo's recorder, still on, erupted with noises, as if something were trying to speak through it. He dropped it to the ground, his heart racing. "This is not normal," Luca murmured, swallowing hard. The wind swirled around them, but it was as if only that part of the convent were affected. Outside, the town remained calm, indifferent to what was happening inside. Antonio's eyes were fixed on Padre Pio, and for the first time that night, he felt a discomfort he could not explain. Then, without warning, the bells stopped, the wind ceased, the night suddenly fell silent as if it were holding its breath. Matteo still clutched his chest, feeling that strange current run through his body. Padre Pio lifted his gaze to the heavens, his lips moving in prayer. Whatever was happening there was far from being explained. The young men realized that they had crossed an invisible boundary, and that, from that moment on, something much greater than themselves was about to happen. The stillness that took over the convent square was almost unbearable. The young men, who had been laughing and teasing moments before, now remained still, as if the very air around them had grown heavier. Matteo still held the hand that had touched the rosary, feeling a strange tingling run through his fingers. Ricardo picked up the recorder from the ground, but its display flashed erratically, emitting only hisses and incomprehensible noises. Antonio tried to speak, but his voice failed him. The wind had stopped, the bells were silent, and the convent seemed immersed in a bubble of suspended time. It was then that something inexplicable happened. A gentle fragrance of flowers began to spread through the air, intense yet delicate, as if an invisible presence had just arrived. Luca looked around, trying to find the source of that aroma, but there were no flowers nearby. His heart raced. He had heard stories that some people smelled roses when they were in the presence of the divine, but that was impossible. Or was it? Matteo stepped back, his face now completely pale. "What is happening?" he murmured, but no one knew how to answer. Padre Pio remained with his eyes closed in silent prayer. His expression showed neither surprise nor fear, only a deep communion with something the others could not see. Suddenly, the street lamps in the square flickered, as if an invisible force passed over them. Then, without anyone touching them, the great doors of the church opened by themselves, creaking softly. The interior was dark, but a golden glow seemed to emanate from the altar, a light that did not come from candles or any other visible source. The group felt a shiver run down their spines. Antonio, who had always been the most skeptical, swallowed hard. His eyes were fixed on the open door of the church, where the light flickered in a supernatural way. He wanted to find a rational explanation, but nothing made sense. Ricardo held his recorder tightly, yet he knew that nothing of that could be recorded. This cannot be happening," he stammered. But it was. Matteo, still shaken by what he had felt when he touched the rosary, finally gave in to what was before them. He fell to his knees, saying nothing, merely feeling the weight of that which he could not comprehend. Padre Pio then opened his eyes. His gaze fell upon Antonio, but this time there was no challenge between them. There was only a young man, standing before something far greater than his reason could explain. In a calm tone, the friar said, "The Lord is closer than you imagine, but to see him, you must first open your heart." At that very moment, a gentle breeze blew, and a stronger glow emanated from inside the church. The group, once so certain of their convictions, now felt that everything they believed was about to change forever. Antonio felt his heart pounding in his chest, as if every beat echoed inside him. Those words from Padre Pio were not just casual phrases. They seemed to penetrate his skin, his pride, his disbelief. He wanted to say something, to maintain his stance in front of his friends, but he couldn't. The scent of roses in the air, the gentle breeze, the inexplicable glow from the altar. None of it made sense, and at the same time, it made perfect sense. For the first time in his life, he felt small in the face of something he could not control. Matteo was still kneeling, his eyes fixed on the ground. His fingers, which had touched Padre Pio's rosary, tingled slightly, but now he no longer felt fear. He felt something different, something he had never experienced before, an immense peace, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He closed his eyes for a moment, and not understanding why, began to cry. It was not a cry of despair, but of relief, as if he had been carrying something for years that he was finally letting go of. Ricardo clutched his recorder to his chest, but there was no longer any need to record anything. The truth could not be contained in words, nor captured by any technology. He looked at Padre Pio, who observed him with a serene gaze. "Some things cannot be explained, only lived," the friar said, as if he knew exactly what Ricardo was thinking. Luca, who had been the most hesitant in the group from the beginning, took a step back, still processing everything. He had never considered himself a person of faith, but something inside him was beginning to break. That light inside the church, the scent of roses, the feeling that time itself had stopped. It all touched something deep within him, something he had never allowed to surface. Unwittingly, his eyes began to fill with tears. He looked at Antonio, hoping his friend would say something, but Antonio was different. His face, once full of arrogance and incredulity, now showed something new, an internal conflict between what he believed and what he was experiencing. Then, without anyone expecting it, Antonio took a deep breath and stepped toward the church. He did not know what he would find inside, but something was calling him. He looked at Padre Pio, who gave him a slight nod, as if to say, "Go, God is already waiting." That simple gesture was enough for the rest of the group to follow. Each of them, in their own way, felt that something was about to change within. The mockery had vanished. What remained now was a reverent silence and a heart ready for something they had never experienced before. Antonio walked hesitantly toward the church, feeling a strange chill in his stomach. Each step seemed to carry an invisible weight, a mix of fear and expectation. He did not know what he expected to find inside, but something propelled him forward. His friends followed in silence, as if any word could shatter that sacred moment. When they crossed the church's threshold, the golden glow that they had seen from afar now appeared even more intense, emanating from the altar, as if the very heavens were pouring their light down. The pews were empty, and the only sound was the soft crackle of flickering candles. The scent of roses was stronger inside, enveloping and welcoming. Ricardo looked around, trying to find a rational explanation for it all, but nothing could justify what they were feeling. Matteo, still shaken, felt his legs give out and fell to his knees, not understanding why. It was not physical weakness, but something within him yielding, a deep feeling of remorse, of recognition of something greater. "My God," he whispered, not even realizing he was speaking aloud. Then something happened. Above the altar, where there had previously been only the penumbra of night, a silhouette began to form in the golden light. It was not a sharp figure, but the presence was unmistakable. It appeared as a luminous shadow, the shape of a man in prayer. The young men held their breath. Antonio's heart pounded so fiercely he could hear it in his ears. The glow pulsed, and for a moment it seemed that the entire church was enveloped in an indescribable peace. Padre Pio, who had entered just behind them, did not seem surprised. He only bowed his head in prayer. Antonio turned to him, seeking an explanation, but the friar only whispered, "He is here." Those words fell upon Antonio like an avalanche. It was impossible to deny. He felt something inside him shatter, as if all the barriers he had built throughout his life were collapsing. His knees gave way, and he fell to the ground, his hands covering his face. The tears that came were not of despair, but of something he had never felt before, the absolute certainty that God existed and was there. Ricardo, Luca, and the others could not take their eyes off the light. They did not know what they were seeing, but they could feel it, an inexplicable presence, something that human words could never describe. That moment was sacred. Time seemed to stop, and everyone there knew they would never be the same after that night. The glow began to soften, as if receding, but something had remained, something invisible yet real, etched into the soul of each one of them. Antonio remained kneeling, unable to hold back his tears. The weight he had carried all his life, that pride which had kept him from believing, now seemed useless in the face of what his eyes had witnessed. He had never imagined that one day he would surrender to faith, but there, before that inexplicable presence, everything he had believed in was crumbling. His chest burned, not with fear, but with a truth that asserted itself without the need for proof. "What have I done my entire life?" he murmured, feeling a tight knot in his throat. Matteo, who had once been the most impulsive and mocking, trembled with emotion. His heart raced, and he felt the need to ask for forgiveness, but he did not know how. His pride still tried to hold him back, yet something stronger pushed him toward humility. He turned to Padre Pio, desperately seeking answers, but the friar only looked at him tenderly. When a child returns to the Father's house, there are no questions, only welcome, he said softly. Those words struck Matteo like an arrow. He closed his eyes and sobbed, feeling his heart purified from within. Ricardo clutched his recorder against his chest, but there was no longer any need to capture anything. The truth could not be confined to words, nor could it be captured by any technology. He looked at Antonio and saw that his friend, the one who had always mocked faith, was in tears, broken before what he had denied for so long. Luca, who had always been the most hesitant, finally gave in and knelt beside him, joining his hands in prayer, even though he did not really know how. I don't know how to pray, he whispered, and Padre Pio smiled. Your heart is already speaking for you. A profound silence took over the church, but it was not an ordinary silence. It was as if an invisible presence embraced each one there. A warmth that filled the chest as if God were holding them in his arms. Antonio closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life he felt what it was to be truly at peace. He no longer needed to fight, no longer needed to prove anything. God had always been there, patiently waiting for him to recognize him. The tears continued to fall, but now they were tears of relief, of liberation. The group of young men who had entered that church that night would never be the same. What had once been arrogance now transformed into humility. What had once been disbelief was becoming a budding faith. And all of this happened not through words or arguments, but through the living experience of the sacred, something that could not be explained, only felt. The group remained there, kneeling on the cold floor of the church, as if they did not want to leave that moment. The golden light that had once emanated from the altar had disappeared, but the feeling of peace remained. Antonio ran his hand over his face, trying to stem the tears that still streamed down. Everything inside him felt different. He, who had always sought logical explanations for everything, now knew that some things did not need to be understood, only accepted. Matteo beside him breathed deeply, as if shedding an invisible weight he had carried for years. It was then that soft footsteps echoed along the church's side corridor. A frail, elderly figure approached them. It was Madre Carmela, one of the oldest nuns in the convent. Her face bore a serene expression, yet her eyes shone as if she already knew what had transpired there. "I felt it," she said, placing a hand over her heart. Something sacred was here tonight. Her voice was soft, but laden with conviction. Antonio looked at her, at a loss for words. How could he explain something that even he could not understand? Beside the nun, a man with calloused hands and simple clothes entered the church. It was Francesco, a local peasant who came every day to pray silently before going to work. He did not know why he had been led to that place at that hour, but something had guided him there. Seeing the young men, kneeling with red eyes, he felt a shiver. He did not need to hear their words to understand. "The Lord has touched you," he said softly, as if afraid to break the sanctity of the moment. Padre Pio remained silent for a long while, observing each one of them. Then, with a gentle smile, he approached Antonio and placed a hand on his shoulder. "God has always been by your side, even when you did not recognize him." Those words made Antonio close his eyes. How had he managed to spend so much time denying that? He felt shame, but also gratitude. Luca clutched the rosary that Padre Pio carried, asking for permission to touch it. When his fingers brushed against the beads, he felt a gentle warmth run through his body, as if that small string of prayer had a life of its own. The nun and the peasant watched them with admiration. For them, there was no doubt. Those young men had experienced something divine. Francesco broke the silence and said, "You must tell what you saw." The world needs to know that God still manifests himself. Antonio took a deep breath, still trying to organize his thoughts. Before that night, he would have mocked anyone who said something like that. But now he knew that a testimony of faith was not about convincing anyone. It was about sharing what had been experienced, and at that moment, he decided that he would never keep that story to himself. The silence still hung over the church when Antonio finally stood up. His legs trembled as if the weight of that experience had been too much for his body to bear. He looked at Padre Pio, seeking something that could confirm that all of it was not a dream or an illusion of his mind. But the friar only smiled, as if he already knew exactly what he was feeling. "What happened here does not need explanation. It needs to be lived," he said, his voice both calm and firm. Matteo, still visibly shaken, wiped his tears with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. "But what now?" he asked, not quite sure what he meant. It was as if that experience had opened up a space within him, but he did not know how to fill it. Padre Pio looked at the young men, and for a moment, his gaze seemed to see far beyond them, as if he could perceive their pains, their fears, their internal struggles. "Now you decide what to do with it. God imposes nothing, he only waits." Ricardo clutched the recorder, now turned off, yet he felt that the true record of that night lay within his soul. He had always been the most skeptical, the most eager for concrete evidence. But now, in the face of what he had witnessed, he realized that faith was not about evidence. It was about surrender. Luca looked at his friends and then at Padre Pio. I don't know if I'm worthy of this," he confessed, his voice choked. The friar nodded slightly and replied, "None of us is, yet we are loved." Padre Pio's words struck deep into Antonio's heart. He who had so often ridiculed the faith of others now felt that God awaited him with open arms, without judgment, without resentment. He lowered his head and took a deep breath. "I don't know how to pray," he admitted. Padre Pio smiled and placed his hand on Antonio's chest. "Your heart is already praying," he said softly. In that moment, Antonio felt an inexplicable warmth fill his being. It was not something that could be described in words, but he knew he would never be the same again. The nun and the peasant watching the scene exchanged a look of understanding. They had seen this kind of transformation before. When God touches a soul, it is never the same again. Padre Pio took a step back and made the sign of the cross over each of the young men. "Carry this night with you, and remember, God never departs. It is we who drift away from him." Those words became etched in the mind and heart of each one of them. Antonio felt a knot tighten in his throat. For the first time in his life, he sincerely wished never to stray from that presence again. The night was well advanced when the young men left the church. The cold wind of San Giovanni Rotondo enveloped them, but for the first time they did not feel that unsettling shiver of uncertainty. They felt only peace. The sky, once laden with clouds, was now incredibly clear, revealing a starry canopy that seemed to shine brighter than usual. Antonio walked slowly, each step carrying both the weight and the lightness of a new beginning. Matteo looked at his own hands, still feeling the gentle warmth from the touch of the rosary. Ricardo held his recorder, knowing that no recording would ever be more important than what was stored within him. As they passed by the convent square, Francesco, the peasant, watched them from afar and smiled. He knew that those young men were no longer the same as when they had entered hours before. Madre Carmela made the sign of the cross and silently returned to her quarters. Deep down, she knew that that moment was not just for the young men. It was a reminder for all who still harbored doubts about God's presence. Padre Pio remained at the church door, watching them leave. His expression was not one of farewell, but of certainty. He knew that that encounter was not ending there. When the group reached the convent's entrance, Antonio stopped and looked back. He wanted to say something, to thank them, but found no words. Padre Pio only raised his hand and made one final gesture of blessing. Antonio felt a knot tighten in his throat and nodded. Then he turned and continued onward. His friends walked beside him, all in silence. But it was a different silence, not the emptiness they once felt, but a silence full of meaning. In the days that followed, something curious happened. Each of them began to notice small changes within themselves. Antonio no longer felt the need to mock the faith of others. Instead, he felt a thirst to understand more. Matteo, once impulsive and skeptical, began seeking moments of solitude to reflect. Ricardo, always so concerned with recording everything with his technology, realized that there were experiences that could only be kept in the heart. And Luca, the most timid of the group, began to feel an inexplicable desire to pray, even though he still did not quite know how. The story of that night spread, yet no one ever managed to fully explain it. The young men could never exactly say what they saw inside the church, and the few words they tried to use were never enough to describe what they felt. The glow, the scent of roses, the invisible yet so real presence, it remained as a sacred mystery, a living testimony that God reveals himself to those who open their hearts. They were never the same again. And even today, when they look at the starry sky over San Giovanni Rotondo, they feel that something from that night has never left them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs that message of faith. Join our community to strengthen your faith and be inspired by real testimonies. Subscribe for more inspiring stories of miracles and overcoming adversity.